Today we have the Raspberry Pi family. We've got the Papa Bear, the Mama Bear, and the Baby Bear. The Raspberry Pi 4, Raspberry Pi 3, it's a little bit older, and a recent but much smaller Raspberry Pi Zero version number 2.
Exactly, Jeff. So we put the whole thing together so people can see the difference between the 3 and 4. And the main big difference, as you can see, is the HDMI.
Yeah, HDMI connectors. Here on the 3, it's a standard HDMI connector. And on the 4, it's 2 micro HDMI connectors.
Right.
Also,
Go ahead, please.
Also on the Zero, it's a mini HDMI mini connector.
So it's obvious to see the difference between the Raspberry Pi 3 and 4. And as you said, this is a Raspberry Pi 02. And to make the difference with the Zero, this kind of a whitish Wi-Fi protected. Yeah, exactly. That's how you make the difference with the Raspberry Pi Zero. So it has the same shape. It looks almost same, but that whitish protection for the Wi-Fi make the difference between the Raspberry Pi 0 and 02. So the 0 does not have it. The 02 have this protection.
Oh, okay. So you would not see this on a old Zero.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start focusing on the Raspberry Pi one by one and see of what they made.
All right, let's get these kids
let's
out
put
of the
it
way.
a little bit there. Okay, so this is our Raspberry Pi 4.
Raspberry Pi 4.
Let's start with the processor.
The processor right here, that little kid is 64 bits.
Yeah.
1.5 gigahertz and 1, 2, 3, 4 quad core inside there. A tiny little area. That's amazing.
That's amazing. That's amazing, actually. And the Cortex A72 have within its architecture many ways to deal with complex computation. So that's a quite good microprocessor for the board.
And that's a standard ARM processor, like you also find in many cell phones.
Exactly. Cell phones or also tablets. And maybe in the near future, we will start having in computers. So that making its way to become a really very popular microprocessor. Oh shit, go ahead.
The memory chip here. In this case, it's 2 gigabytes, but on the Raspberry Pi 4 series, it can be 1, 2, 4, or 8 gigabytes.
Exactly. And the main difference, so the board will look same. The only difference to recognize it beside like the announcement in the box is also the price.
The price.
Yeah.
More RAM, more money.
Exactly. And it can go really expensive when it reaches the 8 gigabyte. We are at the beginning of 2023 and there's a shortage of chips. So the 8 gigabyte is quite expensive right now.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's a big uh-oh. Then for the connectivity.
Connectivity. What are we going to do with this? Let's have a look over here. If you can see, there's an Ethernet connector. And there's also some Bluetooth and Wi-Fi chips on here as well.
Yeah, that's all the options that you can find in a computer.
It's pretty standard.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it's a computer by itself. And then comes
I/O. Now we get busy. Okay, so as we said before, 2 micro HDMI connectors. USB, look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are, I think, the black ones are 2.0 and
the black one are the regular USB.
These are regular?
Yeah, the blue is good.
The blue are the good ones.
Yes.
Okay.
The black are also good, but the blue are nice, I think.
I like the color. It's a lovely color. And then here we have a micro SD, so you can slide your little SD card in there. And we also have some GPIO pins along here. And we've got 2 connectors here and here, where you can connect something like a camera, and those are CSI or DSI connectors.
Yeah, exactly.
So did I get that right?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Perfect. That's perfect. So just to get back on the GPIO, I think that's what makes the Raspberry Pi quite a very nice board, because that allows you to have kind of a microcontroller features, so you can connect with the sensors and interact with other electronics directly, and we will see it in the future episodes, which is a really fantastic feature for the Raspberry Pi. On the other hand, for the CSI or DSI connectors, so they will, like, they are standard connectors, but we mostly use them for the Raspberry Pi to connect to the Raspberry Pi camera called the PiCam,
Sure.
and we will see later on how we do that.
Excellent.
Okay, let's jump to the compatibility.
Compatibility. What does this work with?
Yeah.
This works with the Raspberry Pi OS, which is known as Raspbian, and some other people with way too much free time have created their own versions of that, other Linux distributions, and their own crazy little independent version of Linux that this will work with.
Yeah, Raspberry Pi have its own world of operating systems. The Raspbian, as you said, is the standard official version provided by the Raspberry Pi company to operate the Raspberry Pi. But there's so many people who worked on such crazy operating systems you can use to really specialize your Raspberry Pi.
Do people usually come up with a new OS for just themselves or their one project, or are there some alternative OSs that are very common in some fields?
Actually, it's both. There's even some community that created their own OS especially for the Raspberry Pi. So it depends because, as we said, the ARM processor is a very popular one,
Yep.
and a lot of people play with that to create their own version.
Cool.
Last point.
The power.
Yeah.
More.
With great power comes great consumption of energy. Yes.
Okay, so the power is 3 to 15 watts of power.
Yeah, that's what makes a Raspberry Pi, compared to a normal microcontroller, and we will see it later, a monster in a way of consuming power. This Raspberry Pi 4 with the Cortex A72 is really consuming a lot of power. So if you have a remote, you're managing to have a remote solution, you may think a lot about how to provide enough power to keep it awake for the whole time.
Okay, so that's the power.
Okay. So from the power, the USB,
USB is used for power, and then also there's an audio connector, standard
we
stereo
forgot the audio connector.
output.
We forgot to talk about the audio connector.
We just talked about it. It's
yeah.
an audio connector.
Yeah, just an audio connector.
It's standard stereo, 8-inch headphone type connector.
I would like to have this audio connector, just for fun. Okay, that was the Raspberry Pi 4. Let's jump to the Raspberry Pi 3. So let's bring it here.
Up next.
And talk a little bit about it.
Okay, next contender is the Raspberry Pi 3. Here's the chip again. This is again, quad-core, 1.2 gigahertz, and again, 64-bit. That will be important later when we download the appropriate operating system for it.
Yeah, so and the Cortex A53 is a quite now old architecture and far way less effective than the A72 of the Raspberry Pi 4. So, but still, it's a decent board to compute with. It has enough computation power to do nice stuff.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, RAM, 1 gigabyte of RAM, and so that's a pretty serious limitation compared to the Raspberry Pi 4.
Exactly, it's just the minimum that you should have to operate a decent modern computer. It's even less than the minimum, but still, you can do some stuff with it.
Connectivity. Well, same as last time, actually. The Ethernet is now down here. It's in a slightly different location. And then there's also the standard Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. I/O. Well, let's go back to where we were with the USB connectors. There's 4 of these black USB connectors,
And they're regular USBs.
Standard USB. We also have this standard HDMI connector. And once again, on the back, there's a micro SD chip. And we have the GPIO pins. And we also have the 1-2 CSI or DSI connectors where you can attach something like a camera.
Good. For the compatibility, same operating system that runs on the Raspberry Pi 4 would be running on the Raspberry Pi 3. So especially on this 3B1, so they also able to you are also able to run this multitude of operating system. It's exactly same as the Raspberry Pi 4.
So when you're downloading a Raspberry operating system, you do have to be careful if it's 64-bit or not. And you also have to be careful about the computer you're downloading it to. But it's not like there's a different operating system for Raspberry Pi 3 or Raspberry Pi 4, depending on the hardware.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Power consumption, 3 to 7 of your Earth watts.
Yeah, because the Raspberry Pi 3 is less powerful. As you can see, it's 1.2 gigahertz, and it's an old Cortex. So from power consumption, it's less consuming than the 4, but you do have less efficiency and less output, of course.
Less consumption, less power.
Exactly. Okay, so that was the Raspberry Pi 3. We finally can move to the last one, which is our Raspberry Pi 0.
That's right.
Put it here.
First one was too hard. The second one was too soft. The third one is just right. This is the Raspberry Pi Zero,
and
version 2.
Yep.
And the CPU in this case is a quad core. Once again, look at that. In that little area, there's 4 quads. That surprises me. 1 gigahertz, 64-bit, another ARM processor.
Exactly.
Same processor as the Raspberry Pi B.
Yes, the 3B, same processor, but it's a different variant, which is 1 gigahertz.
Not quite as fast.
Yeah, not quite as fast, but to be honest, it's quite strong for such a small board.
Given the size of the board, yeah, I mean, you can see the CPU takes up a lot of the space. It's not much more than a CPU by itself.
Yeah. So let's go then to the memory.
Memory. So we have 512 megabytes in this case.
And this is quite a limitation.
Hmm.
So when the Raspberry Pi Raspberry 02 was released, a lot of expectation that this small one will have 1 gigabyte of memory. 500, like 1 gigabyte is already a limitation. 512, it's really not enough to certain applications, so which limit a lot the field or the area of this little beautiful board.
So I guess on the plus side, this is a good chance for you to explore your efficient programming capabilities.
That's a nice way to say it.
Connectivity, we got the Bluetooth, we got the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, there's not enough space for the Ethernet.
I/O, there's a mini HDMI connector, and then there's 2 of the.
It's a micro USB.
These are micro USB connectors.
Yeah.
And there's the SD chip right here at the micro SD connector. You got your GPIO pins, and then I see one of the CSI2 connectors down here where you would attach sort of a peripheral device, like a camera.
Exactly. And just to notice that the CSI2 is smaller than the CSI that you find on the Raspberry Pi 4 and 3. So the cable that you will connect the camera should be a different cable to that.
So if you can see it, yeah, there's a standard CSI, and this is the CSI2 that's a little bit smaller.
Exactly.
Cool.
Software perspective, same. Operating system can be installed on the Raspberry Pi 02 because it's 64-bit, and we will see it later on. Finally, the biggest thing is the power consumption.
Look at that, 0.5 to 3 watts, very little power, very little consumption, but it's a very little chip.
Exactly, exactly. So that was the introduction to the three Raspberry Pis. Now we will jump to the next section.
Okay, so next we are going to answer all of your wonderful questions about the required hardware for all of the Raspberry Pi models. And we're going to start off by talking about the USB power supply. So every device has to get power. In the case of all these Raspberry Pis, that comes from USB, right?
Exactly, exactly. So what's going on is for the Raspberry Pi, and as we have seen, the power consumption can be quite significant, and it's really recommended to have a power supply that can deliver more than 2.5 ampere of current because the Raspberry Pi is quite consuming a lot. And if you do have less than that, let's say if you do have a 2 ampere or 2000 milliampere of delivered current, it may generate some issue for your Raspberry Pi, and you may have a signal saying that the Raspberry Pi is not having enough power. On the other hand, if you have less than 1.5 ampere of current delivered, or the adapter that you're using is not strong enough, what will happen? It may destroy the power the adapter itself. So just careful about this and be aware that you need to invest in a good USB adapter.
Don't be fooled. It's a small device, but it is a powerful device, and takes a lot of energy. And next, we're going to talk about the micro SD cards that are the storage where you keep the operating system and the data. So you want to make sure that those are large, like 8 gigabytes or larger, and also fast. You should get the faster versions of the micro SD cards.
Exactly, exactly. So, what happen if you do have a slow SD card? This SD card will maybe not work on your Raspberry Pi. So when we will install the software on it and try to boot it in the Raspberry Pi, it will create some bugs and will not run at all. So just invest in a good SD card that will keep alive because the Raspberry Pi get hot and warm,
Mm-hmm.
so the SD card should be a strong, good quality SD card, so it can live for a long time.
So these are the things you want to make sure you have: right? Like a solid power supply, solid SD card.
Yeah, and just to show, so the SD card is connected here, will be connected here, and this is where you start booting your software. Okay.
Cool. And that micro SD card, as we mentioned, is going to have an operating system on it. So to get the operating system onto the micro SD card, you will need to connect that to your computer via one of these little micro SD card readers, or an adapter that basically lets your computer look at the micro SD card.
Yeah, exactly. So as we will see in the next chapter of this tutorial, we are going to download the operating system and then install it in the SD card before inserting it in the Raspberry Pi.
Okay.
That's these are the three most critical material that you should have as a minimum.
You have to have
to operate the Raspberry Pi. Some other option, like if you would like to have the full Raspberry Pi experience, some other devices can be added.
Excellent. So there's some cool options as well. You can have a little HDMI monitor, or you can have a big HDMI monitor. In this case, it's a little one.
So for our example, we are buying these small HDMI monitors that are used for the Raspberry Pi. It has this HDMI port. It needs its own independent power, but so far that can be more than enough. Even smaller screen should be okay as far as you're able to read the characters.
So the signal that's receiving is coming on a standard size HDMI cable, but the adapter or the connector on the Raspberry Pi side is not necessarily full size.
And this is what we will see in the next chapter. So where for the Raspberry Pi 4, the one that we'll start with it has some special specifications. So first of all, before we jump, sorry, to the monitor, we do have the power supply, and as you have seen, let me take this one out. So the Raspberry Pi 4 is powered using a USB 3, the USB-C,
USB-C
port.
connector.
Yeah, connector, and you will need a cable. Where is the cable? Cable having this USB-C output. So if you do have the both of them are good.
There you go.
Yeah, but
USB to USB-C cable. Any cable will do. If I find a cable in the street, I can use that.
actually no, not at
No?
all. Yeah, so you should be sure that this cable can take the 3 ampere or 2.5 ampere power, so it doesn't get destroyed or limit the power supply to the Raspberry Pi.
Okay, because it is the 5 volts and it is a 2.5 amperes, so it should be a strong cable.
Exactly, exactly. And most important for the Raspberry Pi 4, because if that's the version of the Raspberry Pi that consumes the most power and energy.
It's the hardest working member of the family.
Exactly, exactly. And then we can go back to the adapter. So yeah, go ahead.
We got some of the adapters here. Ooh, we can mix and match and see what they look like. Oh, how cool is that?
Yeah, but we are going to use only the micro HDMI adapter.
In this
one
case,
we'll
yes.
see later on. And this should be connected to here. And that will be the output
There you
to
go.
the HDMI adapter.
From there to your standard HDMI cable into your favorite monitor.
Exactly, exactly. So that was the specific hardware that you need to get for your Raspberry Pi 4. Now we can go to the Raspberry Pi 3, where we need only specific. Yeah, let's bring the Raspberry Pi 3, where we will need, so the HDMI is standard HDMI, and this is for the power. It's a micro USB connectors or head that we need for the power.
Okay, so that's the micro USB, and this is the standard HDMI.
Yeah, you just connect directly your standard HDMI. Good. Next, and the final one for our Raspberry Pi 02. So, same for the power. Let's bring the Raspberry Pi 2, and you just bring this one, and you power it from here, and your Raspberry Pi will be running. Okay?
That's the USB mini.
Exactly. This is the micro USB. Yeah. And also, you will need a very specific hardware. So as you can see for the 02, you don't have any regular USB connectors.
Oh no, where's my USB connectors?
Yeah,
what will I do?
You will need this adapter actually. So by having this adapter here, you can have access to these USBs and you'll be able to connect with your mouse and also whatever the USB connection you do have.
Okay, so one of these is for power and the other is for your USB connections.
Exactly, exactly. And also, not mentioned here, you will need for the HDMI, you will need to have the HDMI, the mini HDMI adapter to be here connected. So you'll be able to have a video output from this little board to your monitor.
Look at that. This tiny little chip is going to put out an HDMI signal to run a full-size HDMI monitor. That is amazing.
Exactly, exactly. That's a few years ago. This kind of things was quite incredible. So we are in lucky time to have this access. Like this Raspberry Pi is relatively cheap, less than $20, and having all this technology within this small Raspberry Pi Zero is quite amazing. That was all for the required hardware.